Everyone in the courtroom froze when the judge's gavel slammed down and his voice thundered, "Bailiff, arrest that attorney now." The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, cutting through the murmurs and scribbles of the packed gallery. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lawyers from both sides, the jury, the bailiff, even the clerks bent over their paperwork. All of them turned their eyes toward the young man standing at the defense table. Daniel Carter, barely in his early 30s, stood tall in his navy blue suit, his tie slightly loosened from the intensity of the last 2 hours. His dark brown eyes did not flinch. The courtroom air grew heavy with tension, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly like insects. His client, a weary factory worker named Miguel Torres, leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table in panic. Miguel's lips parted to speak, but no words came out. The audience erupted into whispers. Did the judge just arrest the lawyer? Can he even do that? The sound of pens scratching against notepads grew faster. The reporters lining the back benches looked like predators circling prey. This wasn't just another corporate liability case. It had turned into theater, high drama that no one had expected. Daniel's heart pounded, but not from fear. His training, his stubbornness, and his unwavering belief in the truth anchored him. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising with a deliberate calmness, and then he looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice steady and clear enough for the whole courtroom to hear. "If you want to silence me for exposing corruption, then by all means order my arrest. But know this, every second I spend in handcuffs will only prove my case in front of the world." A hush fell over the room. It wasn't defiance in his tone. It was conviction. It wasn't arrogance. It was courage. Even the bailiff, a burly man with graying hair and years of service behind him, hesitated at the judge's order. His hand hovered near his cuffs, but his feet didn't move. He had never seen a lawyer stand so fearlessly against a judge in open court. Judge Harold Whitmore, a man in his late 60s with a reputation for stern authority, leaned forward on the bench. His sharp features tightened, his lips curling into something between anger and frustration. For decades, Whitmore had ruled his courtroom with iron control, his word treated as law. To be challenged, no, exposed by a young attorney in front of a packed gallery was something he hadn't anticipated. His gavel trembled slightly as he gripped it. "You're out of order, Mr. Carter," Whitmore bellowed, his voice straining. "This is my courtroom. You will not stand here and accuse me, nor this institution, of corruption." Daniel's gaze never wavered. He could feel his client's eyes boring into him, desperate, pleading. But Daniel also knew dozens of others were watching. Journalists, activists, curious citizens, and even corporate representatives who had expected this hearing to be an easy win. They had expected Daniel to fold under pressure, but instead, he had lit a fire that was spreading too fast to contain. "I'm not accusing the institution, Your Honor," Daniel replied firmly, his tone respectful yet unyielding. "I'm accusing the individuals who've twisted it to protect their own interests. My client deserves a fair trial, not a rigged game, and the people here, they deserve to know the truth." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, some already typing on phones. A camera shutter clicked, though photography had been forbidden. The bailiff shot a glance at the judge, silently asking whether to proceed, but even he looked unsure. Arresting an attorney mid-trial wasn't just unusual. It was explosive. Miguel tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Danny, please, don't make this worse," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Daniel turned his head slightly, lowering his voice. "It's already worse, Miguel. They've stacked everything against you. But if I stay quiet, they'll win. If I speak, we have a chance." Miguel swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the table. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel again, though the sound seemed weaker than before, swallowed by the storm that was brewing. His eyes darted to the gallery, noticing the sea of witnesses to his command. The optics were slipping out of his grasp. "Bailiff!" He snapped again, though there was hesitation in his tone now. "Do your duty." The bailiff finally took a step forward. His boots echoed on the marble floor as he approached Daniel. The entire room seemed to lean forward, holding its breath. Daniel lifted his chin, straightened his back, and looked not at the bailiff but at the crowd behind him. His voice rang out with a clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. "The truth doesn't fear handcuffs," he declared. The audience erupted. Some gasped, others cheered, and a few shouted in protest. A woman near the back rose to her feet, clapping before being shushed by court officers. Reporters scrambled to capture the line, some whispering to each other that this would make tomorrow's front page. The bailiff paused. His hand hovered near Daniel's arm, but he didn't grab him. He looked up at the judge, his eyes betraying his doubt. He had been in this job long enough to know when an order was about to spiral into disaster, and this was one of those moments. Judge Whitmore's face flushed red. He pounded the gavel over and over. "Order, order in this courtroom." His voice cracked, betraying the cracks in his authority. "If you do not sit down and remain silent, Mr. Carter, you will be held in contempt." "I'd rather be held in contempt of court than in contempt of justice," Daniel shot back. His words echoed like a slap, and the crowd stirred again. Even some of the jurors exchanged glances, unease flickering in their eyes. The judge froze. For the first time in years, Harold Whitmore looked like a man cornered, his power slipping away in real time. He had expected submission, obedience. Instead, he was being challenged in a way that threatened not just his authority, but his reputation. Every decision he had made, every connection he had hidden, was suddenly under the spotlight of suspicion. The bailiff lowered his hand, silently stepping back. The room was chaos now, voices rising, pens scratching, cameras snapping. The judge's order had unleashed something he could not control. Daniel stood firm in the center of it all, his calm presence a striking contrast to the storm swirling around him. He knew the risks. He knew he could be dragged to jail, disbarred, even destroyed professionally. But he also knew something else. This was bigger than him. This was about a system that had crushed too many ordinary people like Miguel, while shielding those with money and power. And so, as the gavel thundered again, as the reporters captured every second, Daniel Carter made a silent vow. If this was the price of truth, he was ready to pay it. The arrest order had been given, but in that instant it was clear to everyone watching, it was already backfiring. The arrest order spread across social media within minutes, and what had begun as a tense courtroom moment quickly became a wildfire that no one could contain. A reporter in the back, who had risked sneaking in a small recording device, uploaded the video clip before the hearing even adjourned. Within an hour, hashtags blazed across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Millions watched Judge Whitmore's face twist with rage, watched Daniel Carter stand unflinching as the bailiff hesitated, watched him declare, "The truth doesn't fear handcuffs." It wasn't just a legal drama anymore, it was a symbol. It was David standing before Goliath, a lone attorney daring to stand against power that seemed untouchable. The clip went viral not because of its legal implications, but because it resonated with something deeper. People were tired of watching corporations crush ordinary lives. They were tired of courts that seemed to bend under the weight of money and influence. In Daniel, they saw someone bold enough to say what they had been whispering for years, that justice was no longer blind, it was bought. Cable news networks scrambled to cover the breaking story. Some anchors shook their heads, calling it the most blatant abuse of judicial power in years. Others tried to defend Judge Whitmore, pointing out Daniel's fiery accusations as reckless. But the tide of public opinion was moving fast, and it wasn't on the judge's side. By the time Daniel was escorted out of the courtroom, cameras flashing, protesters had already begun to gather on the courthouse steps. Inside the holding area, Daniel sat on a metal bench, his hands clasped in front of him. The concrete walls felt cold, and the buzzing fluorescent light above flickered. A young officer stood nearby, not with hostility but with uncertainty. She couldn't look Daniel in the eye for long. It was as though she already knew she was guarding the wrong man. "Mr. Carter," she said softly after a long silence, "I just want you to know, people out there are on your side. I checked my phone a minute ago. You're everywhere." Daniel nodded, exhaling slowly. He hadn't spoken since being led away. His mind was racing, not with fear, but with the weight of what had been unleashed. "That's good," he said finally, his voice steady. "Because this isn't about me. It's about Miguel. It's about everyone who's been silenced before him." The officer looked as though she wanted to say more, but the heavy door creaked open, and a senior guard stepped in, glaring at her. She stiffened and returned to her post. The message, however, had already sunk into Daniel's chest like a quiet reassurance. Meanwhile, outside, the courthouse plaza was transforming. At first, it had been a few activists and concerned citizens holding hastily written signs. But as the video circulated, the numbers grew. By late afternoon, the crowd had swelled into the hundreds. Banners appeared: "Justice for the people, free Carter, stop corruption in courtrooms." A chant began, faint at first, then louder until it echoed off the marble walls. "Let him speak. Let him speak." Reporters moved among the protesters, microphones raised, broadcasting live. Politicians began weighing in on Twitter, some condemning the judge's actions, others carefully sidestepping the storm. But the sheer force of voices demanding Daniel's release was impossible to ignore. Miguel sat in the corner of the courthouse hallway, his hands trembling. He wasn't used to attention, wasn't used to being the center of anything. He was just a man who had worked himself to the bone for a company that treated him like disposable machinery. And now, because Daniel had refused to back down, the world was watching his case. Tears burned his eyes, not just from fear, but from gratitude and disbelief. He whispered to himself, maybe we actually have a chance. Back in his chambers, Judge Whitmore paced furiously, his robes trailing behind him. He slammed a stack of papers onto his desk, his breathing heavy. "This is madness," he growled. "One young attorney in the mob thinks they can tear down decades of order in my courtroom. I won't allow it." But as he looked at his phone, the truth glared back at him. Headlines, videos, protests, editorials, his name was being dragged through the mud, his reputation dismantled in real time. A call buzzed on his desk phone. It was from a corporate executive whose company had been at the center of Miguel's case. "Harold," the voice on the other end said sharply, "you need to get control of this. Do you realize what this looks like? If Carter becomes a martyr, everything we've worked for falls apart." Whitmore pinched the bridge of his nose, sweat beading on his forehead. "I'll handle it," he muttered. But deep down, doubt gnawed at him. For the first time, he wasn't sure he could. By nightfall, the courthouse was surrounded. Protesters carried candles, their voices blending into a steady hum of defiance. Police were called to keep order, but even many of the officers looked conflicted, glancing at their phones, clearly aware of the storm raging online. News vans lined the street. Helicopters circled above, their spotlights cutting through the dark. Daniel was escorted out of the holding area to be transferred to a downtown facility. Shackles clinked against his wrists. The bailiff from earlier, the one who had hesitated to cuff him, was the one leading him now. As they walked down the hallway, the bailiff leaned closer, his voice low. "You should know. I've been doing this 25 years. I've never seen anything like today. Whatever happens, you've started something bigger than this case." Daniel gave a faint smile. Then it was worth it. When the courthouse doors opened and Daniel was brought outside, the crowd erupted. Cheers, chants, flashes of cameras. It was like a tidal wave of sound. People pressed against barricades, raising signs with his name. Some shouted encouragement, others simply raised their fists in solidarity. Daniel stopped, just for a moment, looking out at them. The bailiff tugged his arm, but Daniel's voice carried over the noise. "The truth doesn't fear handcuffs." He shouted again, and the crowd roared in response. That line spread like wildfire, replayed endlessly on news clips, shared in memes, painted onto protest banners. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Daniel's image was on the front page of every newspaper. Editorials debated the legality of the judge's actions. Legal scholars on morning shows called it a textbook case of abuse of judicial power. Social media turned him into a symbol, some calling him the people's lawyer, others simply saying he had given them hope. But the real blow came when national outlets began digging into Judge Whitmore's past. A few investigative journalists uncovered records of undisclosed meetings, questionable donations, and an unusually close relationship with the corporation Miguel was fighting. The puzzle pieces were coming together, and the picture was damning. Whitmore tried to defend himself, issuing a statement that Daniel Carter had been grandstanding and disrupting the dignity of the court. But it was too late. The narrative had slipped out of his control. Every word he spoke only fueled the fire, painting him as a man scrambling to cover his tracks. Daniel, still in custody, received updates from his legal team. A senior attorney volunteered to represent him pro bono, citing the importance of protecting the right to defense without intimidation. Civil rights groups filed emergency petitions on his behalf. The pressure mounted until the State Judiciary Committee had no choice but to intervene. Late that night, as Daniel sat in a small cell, a guard came to the door with a piece of paper. "Carter," he said, almost with a hint of respect. "Looks like you've got an emergency court order. You're being released." Daniel stood slowly, his body tired but his spirit unbroken. He gathered his things, a stack of notes, a pen, and the watch his father had given him years ago. As the door clanged open, he stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. When he emerged into the cool night air, a massive cheer went up from the protesters still holding vigil outside. The sound washed over him like a wave. People held up their phones, capturing the moment live. Strangers shouted his name. Some even cried. Daniel lifted his hand in a quiet wave, but inside he felt something stronger than pride. He felt the weight of responsibility. The people weren't just cheering for him. They were cheering for what he represented. He wasn't just an attorney anymore. He was a voice that had sparked something much bigger, something that couldn't be silenced by a gavel or a jail cell. As he walked down the courthouse steps, Miguel pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed Daniel's hands. "You didn't just fight for me," he said, choking on his words. "You fought for everyone." Daniel smiled faintly, squeezing his client's hands. "We're not finished yet, Miguel. This is just the beginning." The cameras captured it all. The moment that sealed Daniel's role as more than a lawyer, more than a defender. He was now a symbol, a spark. And the system that had tried to silence him was starting to unravel under the glare of the world. The judge had wanted to destroy Daniel's credibility. Instead, he had created a hero. The next morning, the city felt different. Newspapers screamed Daniel Carter's name across their front pages, while television anchors repeated the same phrase again and again, the young lawyer who stood against the system. His line, "The truth doesn't fear handcuffs," was plastered on banners, splashed across murals hastily painted overnight, and even printed on t-shirts being sold on street corners. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It had become a movement. For Judge Harold Whitmore, the morning began with silence and then, almost immediately, a storm. Calls flooded his chambers, not of support but of outrage. The Ethics Committee demanded answers. Senators and state officials called for transparency. Anonymous messages arrived in his inbox. Screenshots, documents, whispers of leaks that suggested people were digging deep into his past. His fortress of influence, built over decades, was crumbling brick by brick. He sat in his study at home, papers scattered across his desk, his usually sharp eyes dulled by sleeplessness. His wife entered quietly, setting down a cup of coffee. "Harold," she said softly, "maybe it's time to step down before it gets worse." "Step down?" He barked, though his voice lacked the power it once carried. "Do you have any idea what that would mean?" "It would be an admission of guilt. Everything I've built, everything gone." She looked at him sadly. "It's already gone, Harold. You just don't want to admit it." Across town, Daniel Carter was walking out of the courthouse a free man. He hadn't slept much either, but adrenaline carried him forward. A sea of people was waiting. Reporters, protesters, ordinary citizens. As the doors opened and he stepped outside, the roar was deafening. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, and hands reached out to touch him as though he was a symbol of hope made flesh. He paused on the steps, his dark hair tousled by the morning breeze, his suit wrinkled but his presence commanding. He raised his hand for silence, and remarkably, the noise subsided enough for his voice to carry. "This is not about me," Daniel said, his tone ringing with sincerity. "This is about every worker who's been silenced, every family crushed by greed, and every citizen who believes justice is not for sale. They tried to break me to protect their power, but they failed. Because when people stand together, no gavel, no courtroom, no handcuffs can silence the truth." The crowd erupted. Some cried, others cheered, and chants of "Justice! Justice!" filled the air. Miguel, his client, stood at his side, tears running down his cheeks. For the first time in years, Miguel felt the weight of hopelessness lift from his shoulders. Inside government buildings, phones rang non-stop. The governor's office issued a statement supporting the Judiciary Committee's investigation. Civil rights groups promised to monitor the case closely. Even national figures weighed in, calling for transparency in courts across the country. What had started as a single arrest order was now threatening to expose an entire system. Investigators wasted no time. Subpoenas were issued, records pulled, emails unearthed. The more they looked into Judge Whitmore, the uglier the picture became. Hidden bank accounts, suspicious donations, and private meetings with corporate executives told a story of deep corruption. The corporation at the center of Miguel's case wasn't just influencing decisions, they were practically writing them. When the news broke, the public reaction was volcanic. Protests grew, not just in Daniel's city but across the state. Students marched on campuses, workers organized rallies, and lawyers signed petitions demanding reforms. The legal community was split. Some condemned Daniel for his audacity, but far more praised him for his courage. Whitmore tried to fight back. He gave interviews insisting he had only been upholding the dignity of his courtroom. But the footage of him ordering Daniel's arrest played side by side with reports of his financial entanglements, and his words sounded hollow. Memes mocked him, late-night hosts skewered him, and the once feared judge became a caricature of arrogance and downfall. 2 weeks later, the ethics committee called for an emergency hearing. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time the roles were reversed. Judge Whitmore sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his suit rumpled. Daniel was in the audience, watching quietly, surrounded by supporters. The committee members laid out the evidence: emails, payments, testimony from former clerks. Each revelation hit like a hammer. Whitmore's face grew paler, his hands trembled, and his once commanding voice faltered when he tried to defend himself. The man who had demanded obedience now looked like a relic of a corrupted past. At the conclusion, the committee chair's voice was firm. Judge Harold Whitmore is hereby suspended pending further investigation. Effective immediately. The gavel fell, but this time it wasn't his. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Headlines declared the end of an era, the fall of a giant. But more importantly, they declared the rise of something new. Daniel and Miguel walked side by side down the courthouse steps. Cameras followed their every move, but Daniel didn't bask in the attention. He placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, grounding the moment in what it truly was, a victory not for him but for justice. "You see, Miguel?" Daniel said softly. "They can't hide forever. The truth always finds its way out." Miguel nodded, emotion choking his voice. "You didn't just save me. You saved everyone like me." As they reached the crowd, hands reached out, voices cheered, and chants rose again. For Daniel, the moment was surreal. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He had only wanted to defend one man against a corporation too powerful to challenge alone. But in doing so, he had sparked something greater, a movement that demanded fairness, accountability, and integrity in a system that had forgotten those values. That night, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment, the noise of the city buzzing faintly outside his window. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, offers, requests for interviews, but he set it aside, staring instead at the worn-out briefcase on his table. His father had given it to him when he graduated law school, telling him, "Carry it with honor, because inside it will always be the lives of the people you defend." Daniel ran his hand over the leather, thinking of all that had happened in just a matter of days.
He wasn't naive.
He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more resistance, more attempts to silence him. But he also knew something had changed forever. The judge who had tried to destroy him had instead destroyed himself. The gavel that once silenced voices had become the spark for them to rise louder than ever. Weeks later, when Whitmore officially resigned in disgrace, Daniel attended the hearing not as a lawyer, but as a citizen. He watched the man leave the courtroom through a side door, avoiding the cameras, his head bowed. There were no cheers, no sympathy, only the quiet satisfaction of justice served. But as Daniel stepped back into the sunlight, greeted by smiles and gratitude, he knew the real work lay ahead. Justice wasn't a single battle. It was a lifelong fight, and now he was ready for it. Because in the end, what was meant to break him had made him stronger. The order for his arrest had been the judge's weapon, but it had backfired spectacularly. And from that fire, Daniel Carter emerged not just as an attorney, but as a symbol of what justice could be when fear no longer controlled it. The story ended not with silence, but with voices rising louder and stronger than ever. And for Daniel, that was victory enough, the end.